Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak, your podcast available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday the 18th of March in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the UK's Chancellor Rachel Reeves tells us she's committed to bringing down government borrowing ahead of announcing cuts to welfare.
Israel launches a series of military strikes across Gaza, shattering a shaky ceasefire.
Plus, back down to Earth, 2 NASA astronauts head home after more than 9 months stuck on the International Space Station.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The UK's Chancellor Rachel Reeves has defended her fiscal rules and pledged to bring down government borrowing. She was speaking to Bloomberg as the government's due to announce major plans to cut welfare spending later today. Speaking ahead of that announcement, Reeves sought to justify the measures.
It is important that we balance day-to-day spending with tax receipt and that we get debt down as a share of GDP. Those are the right fiscal rules for the circumstances that we face. But when we're spending £100 billion a year on servicing, I don't think anyone could seriously argue that we don't need to get a grip of government borrowing and government debt.
Reeves is having to rein in spending after higher borrowing costs and lower growth forecasts eroded her slim fiscal headroom from October's budget. But the Chancellor is up against internal pressure from Labour MPs and some cabinet colleagues to soften her stance to avoid spending cuts. Later today, the Work and Pensions Secretary Liz Kendall will announce cuts to welfare spending of as much as £6 billion in an effort to stabilise the public finances without the need for further tax rises.
Israel has launched a series of airstrikes on Gaza overnight, effectively ending a near 2-month ceasefire. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his government will go after Hamas with increasing military strength for failing to release the remaining hostages. Bloomberg's Jerusalem reporter Dan Williams says a continuation of the conflict was inevitable.
Really, this resumption of fighting was just a matter of time. There may be an element of tactical surprise here. Indeed, Israeli public opinion was largely diverted in recent hours by internal discussions about the fate of Israel's Shin Bet security chief, his termination. It could be that discussion was actually meant to provide a smokescreen for the resumption of these Israeli attacks.
Our reporter in Jerusalem, Dan Williams, speaking there. The Hamas-run health ministry said that 44 people were killed by the airstrikes. Local reports suggest that estimate would climb. Hamas released a statement saying Prime Minister Netanyahu had decided to, quote, overturn the ceasefire agreement, putting the captives in Gaza at an unknown fate. Hamas still holds about 60 Israeli hostages.
President Trump is expected to speak to his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in the coming hours about ending the war in Ukraine. Trump has already sparked concerns that he may sacrifice Kyiv's interests in a deal with his comments at the weekend that the US and Moscow are already talking about, quote, dividing up certain assets. The US is pressing for Russia to agree to a 30-day ceasefire that Ukraine has said it's ready to accept. However, Putin has insisted on a number of conditions before committing to any truce. Speaking to reporters, Trump sounded a positive note on the prospects for the call.
It's a bad situation in Russia, and it's a bad situation in Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine is not good, but we're going to see if we can work a peace agreement, a ceasefire and peace, and I think we'll be able to do it.
Meanwhile, the news website Semaphore has been reporting the White House is considering recognising Crimea as a Russian territory in a future agreement. European leaders, meanwhile, are worried that Trump may concede too much on Ukraine's behalf in a direct exchange with Putin. They're pushing for security guarantees and a peacekeeping force to deter Russia from renewing hostilities in the future.
Now, the UK and EU are moving ahead with discussions on how to seize frozen Russian assets to boost Europe's defence spending. Bloomberg's Ewan Potts has the details.
Foreign Secretary David Lammy is meeting with the EU's top diplomat Kaja Kallas in London today. Top of the agenda will be increasing economic pressure on Russia ahead of any peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. Bloomberg understands the discussions will also include how to ensure Europe has the right legal and financial cover to seize billions in Russian assets to boost defence spending across the continent. We're told progress is being made despite resistance from some European countries concerned that the confiscation could breach the principle of a state's immunity under international law. I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
German lawmakers will vote today on a bill to unlock hundreds of billions of euros in debt-financed defence and infrastructure spending. The Conservative Chancellor in waiting, Friedrich Merz, and Social Democrats sealed an agreement last week with the Greens that should secure the two-thirds majority needed for the law to pass the Bundestag. The bill would allow for spending on defence and security above 1% of GDP to avoid constitutional borrowing restrictions. It would also create a special infrastructure fund and give Germany's 16 states leeway to borrow more.
Two NASA astronauts stuck in space for more than 9 months are now on their way home. The return capsule has undocked from the International Space Station and is falling to Earth. Nick Hague is the crew commander.
It was a privilege to call station home, to live and work and be a part of a mission and a team that spans the globe working together in cooperation for the benefit of humanity.
Hague is travelling home along with Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams. The pair had been due to stay at the ISS for 8 days, but technical issues extended their stay by 9 months. The saga has seen SpaceX replace Boeing as the company in charge of the return flight, in an embarrassment to the aerospace giant.
Those are your top stories on the markets. We saw US stocks rising for a second day yesterday. The S&P 500 finished up 0.6%, with 90% of stocks in the S&P 500 finishing higher as well. Mega cap tech, though, absent from the rally. The Mag 7 index ended more than 1% lower. In Asia today, we are seeing equities gain on the positive Wall Street close as well. Third straight session of gains there. The MSCI Asia Pacific index 0.9 higher. The Nikkei 225 up by 1.3%, and tech shares in Hong Kong are up by 2.9%. And ahead of the German vote today, we've got the euro trading a touch weaker against the dollar, but still above the 109 handle, 109.11. European stock futures 0.4 higher on Euro Stoxx 50.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on our interview with the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, plus that journey home for the astronauts from the International Space Station. But another story caught our eye this morning. Stephen, do you ever fancy putting your feet up a bit?
Oh, yes, is that an offer? Shall I take the rest of the day off?
Well, there's a new trend, or maybe the return of an old trend on social media. This apparently among Gen Z. It's called micro-retirement. It's a temporary break from work to combat burnout.
I mean, at a risk of saying turbo eye roll at this time in the morning. Yeah. I mean, look, it's a great idea. It's not like it's a new idea.
No, it's not. But let me get to the end of it, because Bloomberg's Erin Lowry has anticipated your eye roll, Stephen Cow. And she says, look, micro-retirement, it's not exactly like a sabbatical or a gap year. It is a break. It's not employer granted. So basically, you don't get pay and you don't have a guaranteed job upon your return. So it's meant to be a kind of lifestyle choice. But she says that actually employers should think a little bit harder about this and maybe incorporate these sorts of breaks as an offer to their employees as a kind of workplace benefit. Why? Because it's so difficult to actually find workers who are talented. Training and replacing workers is so expensive. And actually in the US, a very big chunk of the workforce is now Gen Z and millennials. So, guys, you've got to listen to the kind of younger worker.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised by one of the estimates quoted in this piece as well, saying that replacing an employee can cost between half and twice their salary, depending on how in demand the sector of the worker are. So, I mean, look, I think that this is a very good idea, and I think that it can be used as a very helpful workplace perk to anyone that wants to listen to me. Let's bring you more, though, on our top story this morning and our interview with the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, ahead of the UK government unveiling plans to cut benefits spending. Our UK correspondent spoke to the Chancellor, and she's with us now. Lizzie, good morning. This is an announcement that we're expecting from Liz Kendall, and Pension Secretary, later. First of all, what are we expecting the government to announce?
So it's an announcement that they're going to cut social security spending by as much as £6 billion to encourage more people back to work. Now, speaking to Reeves yesterday, she really is under pressure from her cabinet and her party to soften these welfare cuts, which of course come on top of cuts to aid to pay for the defence spending and the winter fuel allowance for pensioners. So she's being accused of being a Labour Chancellor in Conservative clothing, and many are calling on her to instead raise taxes or loosen her fiscal rules. But she unequivocally, in my conversation with her yesterday, dashed those hopes. To anyone who says just loosen the fiscal rules, she says the UK must get a grip of borrowing and debt. And to anyone who says, just go easier on benefits, she says the current system's unsustainable and reform is absolutely necessary to get people back into work.
OK, what will Reeves then deliver in the spring statement? Because all of these arguments are happening before the next sort of major announcements, 26th of March. And then does it basically mean tax rises to come in the autumn budget?
Very perceptive of you, Caroline. Well, we ended up talking a lot about the headroom that she left herself in the last autumn budget because of the fiscal pressure now and the urgency she faces now, stemming back really to that. This choice between tax rises, spending cuts and breaking her fiscal rules goes back to her decisions in October. You could argue that she already knew then her legacy from the Conservatives, and she knew that there was a strong chance that Donald Trump was going to return to the White House. So you could argue she should have given herself more of a fiscal cushion. Now, she says she left more margin for error against her fiscal rules than her predecessor, Jeremy Hunt. But the truth is, it was only a tiny bit more, and he'd already left it at historic and dangerous lows. She's also unapologetic about her tax rises, even if the fear about them has held back investment and sentiment, and we know that from the surveys. But if you read between the lines, as I think you are, Caroline, if she is wedded to the fiscal rules and she's unapologetic about her tax rises, I agree that there is a strong signal that there could be more tax rises in the next October budget, which is really where the focus is. And she's saying that it's important to build up headroom, which suggests that she's going to leave a bigger margin than last time, which was £9 billion, when she comes to her spring statement next week. And that's a very strong signal to the bond vigilantes if there were worries about what she's going to do.
In terms of what the government has already done, though, part of the mission for growth involved getting the regulators together to try and cut red tape for businesses. What sort of plans did Rachel Reeves make after that meeting with those regulators yesterday?
Well, yeah, this was really the reason we were brought to 11 Downing Street to do this interview. She'd had 8 of the biggest regulators round, including the Financial Conduct Authority, and she was laying out a plan to cut regulatory costs to businesses by a quarter. Part of this is axing and merging regulators. Some of that's already been done. But the point, of course, is to boost growth. And it was unfortunately on a day when the OECD had cut the UK growth outlook for this year and next.
Lizzie, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Bloomberg's UK correspondent, Lizzie Burden.
2 NASA astronauts stranded in space for more than 9 months are on their way home. Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams were set to only spend a week in space, but technical issues extended their stay. Bloomberg's James Woolcock is with us for the latest on this story. James, where is the return craft now?
So it undocked from the ISS just in the past hour. With any kind of space launch, there are still big risks, there are still big concerns, but so far everything is going without a hitch and it's on its way home.
Why were they in space for such a long time in the first place?
I mean, this is what has gotten to the heart of this story, that's gotten the world's attention. Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore were supposed to be in space for 8 days. They packed a week's worth of toiletries. They didn't have 286 days worth of clothes, yet that's how long they ended up there. The Boeing Starliner that was there to take them up had issues with its thrusters and was having helium leaks, and so NASA made the call to swap the return craft to a SpaceX one. Now that ended up delaying their return flight by 9 months. So it is in space travel, not the longest time anyone has been in space. That is still held by a Russian cosmonaut, but it's one of the most uncertain space travels that anyone has ever had, where going up and not having any kind of certainty when you're going to be coming back.
James, why has this story drawn so much attention? I mean, it does. Lost in Space is a good headline.
I think there's a few reasons, Stephen. I mean, it reminds everyone that although the moon landings were, more than 50 years ago at this point, there is still so much we haven't conquered in space. There are only 14 people in space as we speak right now. And it speaks to it's remind the general public that there is so much still to be explored and figured out and at risk. And then there's the business side of this. Normally, if there was an issue with NASA, it's traditional to ask the Russians for help. The Soyuz is the only other capsule that can go up to the ISS. However, now, because SpaceX exists, when there was issues issues with Boeing, there is a kind of business angle to this as well. You have a competitor, you have a different US private rival. And the story of actual progress, although it has been a bit embarrassing for Boeing, has been a pretty impressive story as well. The one thing I would add to take away from kind of the science and the space and the majesty of it is it's also slightly become a politicised issue. Donald Trump, the US president, in January said that the astronauts had been abandoned in space by the previous Biden administration. It's worth saying both NASA and the astronauts themselves strongly dispute that. But that and the president's encouraging Elon Musk to take over the mission and to bring them back even earlier has also drawn a lot of attention to this issue. And we will all be watching when they look, hopefully, to enter reorbit around 9 p.m. UK time, 10 p.m. UK time, which I believe is 3 p.m. in California.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.